Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a pretty provocative question from our source material. Was the almost simultaneous creation of the CIA and the State of Israel just a coincidence, or was it the beginning of something much, much deeper?
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at one crucial year. Then, we'll explore the shared origins of these two entities and zoom in on a couple of defining incidents. After that, we'll trace how things moved from the shadows into the open. And finally, we'll look at the overarching pattern that our source identifies.
So, let's set the stage. Our story really kicks off in the chaos right after World War II. It was a moment when the old world was gone, and two new, incredibly powerful players were about to step onto the scene.
And what's really interesting here is just how close these two events were. I mean, you've got an intelligence empire designed for total secrecy, and a new nation literally born out of conflict. And they both come into being in the exact same strategic universe, less than a year apart.
And this is the big question the source wants us to grapple with. Was this just random historical chance, or did their parallel births hint at a much deeper connection, right from day one?
Okay, so if there is a connection, where did it come from? Well, according to the source, you've got to trace it back to their common ancestor, the wartime spy agency, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. And at the heart of this whole thing is one guy, James Angleton. His deep personal relationships with Israeli intelligence networks, relationships he built during the war, they became the very foundation of the institutional bond that followed. And this slide really gets to the heart of this source's point. When you strip it all down, both of these organizations were basically in the same business. They were using remarkably similar secret methods to get what they wanted politically.
In fact, while the CIA was still getting on its feet, Zionist operatives were already running this huge, illegal arms network inside the United States. And right here, the source argues, a critical pattern gets set in stone. You get an investigation, but you never get a prosecution. Okay, so that's the theory. But how did this relationship actually play out in the real world? The source gives us two really powerful examples that basically define the whole dynamic.
First up, there's the Khrushchev gift. So Israeli intelligence gets its hands on this bombshell speech. They give it to the CIA, but with a major string attached. Only James Angleton can see it. This move makes the CIA structurally indebted to them and cements Angleton as the one guy you have to go through.
Okay, so that's what happens when their interests line up. But what about when they don't? Especially when you're talking about the biggest, most sensitive secret of them all.
And that leads us straight to the NUMEC affair. This is a story about a nuclear fuel plant in a little town in Pennsylvania, but our source says it had these massive global consequences.
And we are not talking about a rounding error here. We're talking about over 300 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium that just vanished. That's enough to build several nuclear bombs.
The source zeroes in on this one key moment in 1968. You have this supposedly scientific visit to the plant, but look who's on the team, top-tier Mossad and Shin Bet officers, and the head of Israel's entire nuclear weapons program. This was not your standard inspection team.
So what was the conclusion inside the U.S. government? Well, according to the source, the CIA was convinced the uranium ended up in Israeli bombs. But the cover-up went all the way to the president himself. You have Lyndon B. Johnson telling his CIA director to keep his own secretaries of state and defense completely out of the loop.
So from these deep, dark, covert dealings, the source then tracks how this whole relationship starts to come out of the shadows. It becomes this really powerful and very public force in American politics and foreign policy.
The source argues you can see this personified in figures like Sheldon Adelson. I mean, he just came right out and said it. I'm a one-issue person. That issue is Israel.
And yet, even with this incredibly close public relationship, you have official U.S. government reports saying something else. A 1996 report concluded that Israel runs the most aggressive spy operations against the U.S. of any ally, a finding that the source claims has pretty much been swept under the rug.
The source then draws what it sees as a straight line from this kind of influence to massive foreign policy shifts. It points to this 1996 policy memo written for Israel's incoming prime minister and argues that its recommendations basically became the playbook for the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. So where does all of this leave us? What's the big picture? The source is careful to say this isn't some grand conspiracy. Instead, it argues that what we're seeing is a consistent, structural pattern of power that's been shaping history for over 7 decades.
And that pattern, the central idea that keeps coming up again and again, is this: investigation without prosecution.
You get all this evidence, but it leads to zero consequences. It's like certain activities on U.S. soil are just considered too politically hot to handle, so they never reach a legal conclusion.
And the source lays out the receipts, right? You see it with the arms smugglers back in the 40s. You see it with the Numek affair. You see it with later spy cases, and even with questions surrounding 9/11. In every single case, the source claims the story is the same. There's an investigation, but the network itself is never prosecuted.
And so, we'll leave you with the source's final, pretty challenging thought. It's a quote that basically asks us to consider the implications of a history that, as it argues, has been deliberately left unread.